Some fantasy studs seem to be back on track, but with a couple more injuries and the bye weeks finally here, we need to reinforce our rosters through the waiver wire. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? There are a few players that we need to discuss that might be sitting out on your waiver wire right now. And whether or not you're using them for an injury replacement or with the bye weeks being here for week 5, we definitely need to have all of these guys on our radar. Hit that like button for me, subscribe if you're new here. We're going to talk about running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends that we should be taking a shot at right now, plus some streaming options at the quarterback and defensive spots. And then maybe we need to talk about a few players that it's time to drop and move on from. Let's kick it off at running back first, though. Now, even though Javonte Williams did end up missing a big portion of the game this week, and it doesn't sound like he's going to miss a lot of time, if any. That's of this recording. Of course, things could change. So we need to be taking a look at the guy who stepped up in his place, Jaleel McLaughlin. McLaughlin averaged over 10 yards per carry on the 7 carries that he had this weekend, and he chipped in a couple of receptions as well, including a receiving touchdown. And now he's starting to look like a guy that could end up replacing Samaje Perine as the number 2 in this backfield. Again, Javonte Williams may not even miss any time, so if you're picking up McLaughlin, he might not be a guy that we can start right away, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on, especially if Javonte Williams is limited for any reason, and he truly is unseating Perine as the number 2. All right, we may not be picking up Pierre Strong Jr. this week because the Cleveland Browns are headed into their bye week. But this is now 2 weeks in a row that he's looked a lot better than Jerome Ford. And I know there's a lot of people out there that don't want to give up on Ford. But with Kareem Hunt still working his way back and Pierre Strong playing a lot better than him the last 2 weeks, even with the couple of touchdowns that Ford had 2 weeks ago, Pierre Strong Jr. is coming on very, very strong. And coming out of the bye, if there's anybody dealing with injuries or buys in week 6, definitely there's going to be an option for us to take a look at Strong being added to our lineups. Miles Sanders was essentially not practicing for the better portion of the week, and it finally had come out on Saturday that he was likely to play and end up being okay for Sunday. But then Chuba Hubbard ended up out-snapping and out-touching him anyway. So how banged up really is Miles Sanders? Well, if he's still banged up heading into this matchup against Detroit this week, I'm definitely thinking we're going to see some Chuba Hubbard, because with the Detroit Lions pass defense and their rush right now, Bryce Young's going to have to be getting the ball out quickly, and Hubbard's going to be helping the most with that. I think football fans, Lions fans, fantasy owners alike were surprised and shocked when the NFL announced that Jameson Williams would be returning 2 weeks early from his suspension, even though that suspension was crap to begin with. But going up against Carolina this week, you might get excited to start him, but don't do it. Now, I'm including him in this video because if I didn't, everybody in the world would be asking about it. I don't think Jameson Williams is close to making any type of an impact for the Lions. Josh Reynolds and Jared Goff have a great connection as the number 2 right now. Jameson Williams is going to be a guy that maybe after their bye, you start to see him take on a little bit of a bigger role in terms of the big playmaker, but he's going to be spotty throughout the rest of the year, I believe. But keep an eye on it. If you've got room to add him, there's always room to have a big playmaker on your bench. We could definitely start him in some good matchups, and if we're dealing with buys later on. But for right now, just be sure to temper your expectations. Romeo Doubs, even with Christian Watson back this past week, looked like the number 1 in this offense. And it's been really hard to try and figure out who that guy will be. Now, maybe one reason was because Luke Musgrave ended up going out with a concussion. But even with that being said, there was some concern that Doubs, with Christian Watson back, would end up taking a back seat. And he still ended up leading the team in targets this past week. If you're looking for an emergency option at the wide receiver position, especially in a PPR league, I think Doubs is a guy that week in and week out, we might be able to trust with a decent floor. Marvin Mims continues to be a guy that doesn't get a whole lot of looks in the passing game, but when he does, he turns them into big plays. And with the bye weeks coming up, we might be searching for some guys that give us a little bit more ceiling than others. And that's exactly where Marvin Mims is going to come into play. Just keep in mind that if you start him, he could end up getting you 0 points. But if he puts up a couple of big plays, 10 points definitely could be within the realm of possibility. Yes, the Chicago Bears got back on track. Yes, it was against one of the most historically bad defenses that we've ever seen. But with that being said, Chase Claypool was told to stay home this week. Chicago didn't want him anywhere near the stadium, and that's exactly what he did. That's going to leave a little bit of opportunity for Darnell Mooney to establish himself as the number 2. And hopefully Justin Fields can get himself back together and use this as a stepping stone in the right direction. And if he does, we are definitely on track to see a step up in usage in the passing game for DJ Moore and Darnell Mooney. Terrace Marshall Jr., pretty decent week against Minnesota this past weekend, and now he's going to be facing the Detroit Lions defense, who has been very good over the last couple of games. I'm going to be cautious with him. I don't think he's a guy that we're starting right away, but if he can really establish himself as the number 2 right next to Adam Thielen, there's definitely going to be some possibility, knowing that the Carolina Panthers are going to be trailing quite a bit. The good news for Mike Evans is he's going to have a chance to rest that hamstring, and we haven't heard how bad it really is, but now he's not going to have to turn around and try and play. Giving him that extra week could end up making him just fine for week 6. But Devin Tompkins and Trey Palmer are going to be the 2 wide receivers on that team that we need to keep an eye on. Are we picking them up this week? Well, if you have an empty roster spot and you want to try and be ahead of the game, you definitely could. Don't use a waiver wire on either of them, though. And then next week, if for some reason Mike Evans is still banged up, at least we're going to have one replacement to use. Even with the Cincinnati offense looking really, really bad right now, T. Higgins having a fractured rib is definitely going to give the opportunity for Tyler Boyd to step up and see an increased role over the next several weeks. Keep an eye on his usage. 7 targets this past week after T. Higgins ended up going out early in the game. If we continue to see those targets build up for Tyler Boyd, he's definitely going to be a wide receiver 3 option and maybe even wide receiver 2 in PPR leagues. On last week's waiver wire show, when Mike Williams went down, we talked about Josh Palmer and Quentin Johnson, and I told you all at that point that Josh Palmer was likely going to be the play. He didn't end up having a great game until he caught like a 50-yard pass at the very end. So he ended up putting up like 3 catches for 70 yards. So you just barely lucked out there if you started him. Not a great week for him, but he's going to continue to be probably the number 2 target in this offense until Austin Eckler returns. And even if you're not picking him up right now because of the bye, I definitely would end up stashing him if you don't need to use a high waiver priority to try and pick him up. The Arizona Cardinals and Joshua Dobbs are playing a lot better than anyone expected, and Michael Wilson was a great benefactor from that this past week. A huge game for him, and maybe establishing himself as the number 2 right next to Marquise Brown. Continue to keep an eye on this guy. I know it's going to be really hard to trust this Arizona offense. They might be playing a little bit above what we anticipated right now, but how long does that continue for? And on a team with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, Braxton Bryos was the guy that ended up scoring this past week. If the Miami Dolphins find themselves in any type of shootouts moving forward, this is going to be a guy that has some PPR upside. Really only though PPR leagues. Anything less than that, I'm not real interested in it. However, for those of you in deeper leagues, definitely keep an eye on the possibility of adding this guy if you end up needing to get yourself through a bye at any point in time. All right, get your 2023 football bingo board out and let me know if you have a square that said Jonnu Smith outperforms Kyle Pitts, because that is currently where we're at with the Atlanta Falcons. Now, I don't know if I'm running to pick up Jonnu Smith. He definitely is a guy in the past I have liked his upside, and maybe he doesn't have it right now, but after a big game in London this past week, he definitely needs to be on our radar. Jake Ferguson finally putting together a big game, led the team in targets, 7 catches for 77 yards, and showed that high ceiling that we've talked about a couple of times over the previous weeks. Is it something that continues? We're going to have to keep an eye on that. But he's still very widely available in a lot of leagues, which is crazy to see. Barely around 50 to 55% owned. I'm not sure why that is, but if he's still available on your waiver wire, he definitely should be on your team given the state of the tight end position. Maybe one of the biggest benefactors of Chase Claypool being told to stay home is going to be Cole Kmet. Or maybe he just benefited from facing one of the worst defenses in NFL history. Whatever it may be, for those of you that have stuck with him, he finally ended up having a big week this week. We really have to hope that that continues to happen. But because of his poor start to the season, he's been dropped in a lot of leagues. So if I were you, I would definitely take a shot at him if you've been struggling at the position. Week 5 is our first week with bye, so let's talk about some streaming options. Starting at the quarterback position, we're going to kick it off with CJ Stroud. This is a guy that is now past Andrew Luck for the second most passing yards ever within 4 games to start their career. He looks absolutely incredible. My quarterback one in this draft looks every bit of a part of what the film showed us in the breakdowns this offseason. He's making this Houston Texans team, I mean, dare I say, competitive, and because of that, they're throwing the ball quite a bit and they're trusting him to make the reads and do what needs to be done. CJ Stroud looking really, really good. And this week in this matchup against Atlanta may end up being a little bit of a tougher matchup. Atlanta's defense really isn't that bad, but he should still end up doing just enough to give you what you need at the quarterback position. And Sam Howell from Washington getting the Chicago Bears this week. Their defense, not that great at all. So if there's an opportunity for Sam Howell to step up and reach a high upside, it's going to be in this matchup and definitely would be a great help for your fantasy team. Detroit gets the 0-4 Carolina Panthers at home this week, and with the way their defense has played the last couple of weeks, causing pressure, forcing turnovers, Carolina and Bryce Young are going to be in for a shocker if they don't get their stuff together and really make sure that they take advantage of any type of opening the Lions give them. But if you need to stream a defense this week, streaming the Lions against Carolina, even if they were to give up a few points, should create enough turnovers and sacks to help you out there. The Houston Texans going up against Atlanta. If they can make Atlanta one-dimensional and really stop the run and force them to rely on Desmond Ridder, then they're going to create some turnover opportunities for themselves and definitely some chances to be in the backfield to get a few sacks as well. If Atlanta just holds on to the football by running and running and running, you might not get those extra points for Houston's defense to reach their ceiling, but they definitely should be a safe option for you. All right, for players to drop, I'm including the 3 names that I've heard people ask about the most, either last week or heading into this week or after the games on Sunday. And from Atlanta, people are asking about Tyler Algier and Kyle Pitts. And since week 1, Tyler Algier hasn't really done anything. And even though Bijan Robinson hasn't really reached that great of a ceiling over the last couple of weeks, he's still playing extremely well, running for over 100 yards, and we've seen his snap count increase each of the first 4 weeks as well. At this point, we are getting very close to needing to drop Tyler Algier. And the reason why is because since week 1, he hasn't just been fantasy dependent on his own. Those touchdowns just haven't been there. They are having trouble going back and forth between the 2 guys. And because Bijan's been the best option, they're just rolling with him a little bit more to try and create a spark in this offense. If you own Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier, then at that point, I would wait and not drop Tyler Algier. But if you just have him, just because, either try to trade him to the Bijan owner or maybe be done with him at this point. And for Kyle Pitts, I hate to say it, but at this point, we've reached a time where we're basically going to call him droppable. The guy has had almost at this point 2 full seasons to show us something in this offense. And whether you blame it on Pitts, whether you blame it on Ridder, whether you blame it on the coaching staff, it really doesn't matter. Kyle Pitts has done absolutely nothing. Over the course of the last 3 seasons, which he's missed some time in, he hasn't done anything to be considered fantasy startable outside of a few games here or there. At this point, I'm completely done with Kyle Pitts. And then I saw a lot of questions about Roschon Johnson after the game on Sundays. This past week, I continue to tell people Khalil Herbert has not done anything to lose his job. So while we're stashing Roschon Johnson, and this week he may have even been startable in that matchup, even though he wasn't, Herbert was going to continue to be the guy, and he showed that on Sunday. Now, for those of you that have been stashing Roschon Johnson, just continue to stash him. Again, this was a really easy matchup. And for those of you out there starting Khalil Herbert, you got a great performance from him. But all that did was to continue to lock him in as the starter, and it's going to prolong Roschon Johnson taking over. But at any point in time, if Herbert were to go down and Roschon Johnson steps in, then at that point, you would have yourself a fantasy viable running back. For now, just continue to hold him, but if you need the roster space with the bye weeks coming up, with the bad performance this past week against Denver, you can probably drop him and get away with it. There you go, Headliner Nation. Not a ton of names to take a look at heading into week 5, but still definitely a lot of opportunity for us to hit the waiver wire and upgrade our teams. Make sure you hit that like button for me though. Subscribe down below if you're new to the channel, and make sure that you leave me a comment if you have any questions about players that were not included in this episode, especially dropping players. If you want to drop someone and pick them up, just in the comments below, just say drop player, pick up player, and I'll respond either yes or no. Headliner Nation, I appreciate you. Peace out, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.